On November 11, 1933, in the Albert Hall of the University of Leipzig, 960 professors of German universities signed a public declaration of allegiance to Adolf Hitler. The bound volume, beige cardstock cover, Gothic script title, 136 pages, still sits in the rare books room of the Sächsische Landesbibliothek in Dresden. The signatures are by hand on the back pages. The smell is the smell of brittle interwar paper, of glue gone hard, of a century of unopened shelves. The post-war consensus has handed down a consoling story for 90 years. Hitler was carried by the desperate, the unemployed, the uneducated, the rural. The data layers destroy that story. Weimar Germany held more Nobel laureates per capita than any nation in human history, 33 by 1933. The literacy rate by the 1925 census of the Statistisches Reichsamt was 99.5%. Between 1901 and 1933, Germany produced roughly 30% of all chemistry doctorates awarded on Earth. The Bildungsbürgertum, the educated bourgeoisie, was the most credentialed social class on the planet. And in the March 1933 election, the NSDAP's strongest support did not come from the slums. It came from the Protestant university towns, Göttingen, Tübingen, Marburg, Erlangen, then the Cascade, April 7, 1933. The Gesetz zur Wiederherstellung des Berufsbeamtentums removes Jewish and politically suspect professors from German universities. 1,200 academics dismissed by year's end, documented by Edward Hartshorne in 1937. May 10, 1933. The Berlin Openplatz, 20,000 books processed by fire, organized not by SA thugs but by the Deutsche Studentenschaft, the official student union whose leadership held doctorates. November 11, 1933, the Leipzig Declaration, 960 signatures, including Martin Heidegger, rector of Freiburg, age 44, Karl Schmidt, jurist of Berlin, age 45, Eugen Fischer, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, age 59. The intellectual high command of the most educated nation in the world signing its name in ink. What the post-war consensus would call a mass psychosis was, on that November morning in Leipzig, something far more disturbing. The considered, written, professionally credentialed choice of the men who taught the country how to think. The Bildungsbürgertum, the educated class that built the modern German state. In Berlin, in the year 1810, Wilhelm von Humboldt founded a university that would, within a single century, become the model every serious nation on earth copied. He was a Prussian baron, a linguist, a diplomat, a senior official of the Prussian Ministry of the Interior. He had been given a single mandate by the new state: rebuild the German mind after the catastrophe of Jena. He did not build a school. He built a constitutional category. The professor in the Humboldtian model was not an employee. He was a Beamter, a civil servant with constitutional rank, a lifetime appointment, an oath of loyalty sworn to the state itself, and a salary paid from the Ministry of Culture. He was, in the literal legal sense, an organ of the German state. The university was its conscience, the seminar room was its laboratory. The habilitation, the second doctorate required to teach, was its gatekeeper. The Lehrfreiheit and Lernfreiheit, the freedoms of the professor to teach and the student to learn, were written into the funding statutes. By 1900, this system had conquered the educated world. American PhD programs at Johns Hopkins, founded 1876, and at Chicago, founded 1890, were modeled directly on the seminar rooms of Leipzig and Berlin. British dons traveled to Göttingen to learn mathematics. Japanese ministries sent their best students to study constitutional law in Heidelberg. The Russian intelligentsia, before 1917, sent its physicians to Munich and its physicists to Berlin. By 1914, when the war began, the German university was the world's prestige factory. The historian Fritz Ringer, working from the Prussian Ministry of Culture employment records and publishing his findings as The Decline of the German Mandarins at Harvard University Press in 1969, gave the class a name. He called them the German Mandarins. The word was exact. Like the Confucian scholar officials of Imperial China, The German professoriate occupied a constitutional space above the merchant, above the industrialist, above even the army officer in moments of civilian rule. They were the guardians of Kultur. The word itself meant something the English word culture cannot translate. It meant the inwardness, the philosophical seriousness, the Bildung, the lifelong cultivation of the educated soul, that the Mandarins believed separated the German mind from the materialism of the Anglo-Saxon West and the chaos of the Slavic East. The Mandarins held the chairs at 23 German universities by 1914. They edited the journals. They sat on the doctoral examination boards. They controlled by formal procedure who entered the Beamtentum and who did not. Their salaries were modest by industrial standards. Their social authority was unmatched. A full professor at Heidelberg or Berlin was addressed by his title in private correspondence. His wife was Frau Professor. His house was kept by a servant. His university salary could not, by itself, have funded. But tradition, the marriage networks of the educated class, and the inherited capital of a century of professional formation had funded it for him. In October 1914, 3 months into the war, 93 of these men, the most distinguished scientists, artists and scholars in Germany, signed a public manifesto known as the Aufruf an die Kulturwelt, the appeal to the cultured world. The signatories included Max Planck, Wilhelm Röntgen, Fritz Haber, Paul Ehrlich, the historian Adolf von Harnack, the dramatist Gerhard Hauptmann. The manifesto denied the German army had violated Belgian neutrality. It denied the destruction of Louvain and the deaths of civilians. It denied the loss of the medieval university library. The signatories had not, in most cases, investigated the facts. They had signed because the German state was at war and the Mandarins understood themselves as its intellectual general staff. The manifesto was translated into 10 languages within weeks. The international scientific community took note. Many of those signatures would, in private correspondence after 1918, be quietly regretted. Few were ever publicly retracted. The Aufruf was the rehearsal. The Leipzig Declaration of 1933 was the performance. Then came 1918. The war was lost not in the Mandarins' lived perception on the battlefield, but at the diplomatic table. The Versailles Treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors on June 28, 1919. The Kaiser was gone. The constitutional state the Mandarins had served, the state that had given them their rank, their tenure, their cathedral pulpits in the lecture halls, was gone. In its place, a republic written in Weimar by lawyers and social democrats, signed in haste, hated by the right and distrusted by the left, drafted in the language of the very Western liberalism the Mandarins had spent their lives writing books against. The professoriate did not riot. It did something far more consequential. It wrote. Across the 1920s, in journals the Mandarins themselves edited, Logos, the Preußische Jahrbücher, the Hochschule- und Ausland-Series, the Deutsche Vierteljahrsschrift für Literaturwissenschaft und Geistesgeschichte. A literature emerged that the historian Friedrich Meinecke, in his 1946 retrospective Die Deutsche Katastrophe, would later acknowledge by name. The German university press of the 1920s, Meinecke wrote, had drafted in print the intellectual permission for what came after. The defeat of 1918 was reframed not as a military outcome, but as a wound to civilization. The Republic was reframed not as a constitutional order, but as a foreign imposition. The materialism of the West and the Bolshevism of the East were reframed not as rival political systems, but as twin assaults on the German soul. The literature had a vocabulary: Volk, Schicksal, Gemeinschaft, Untergang. These were not party slogans in 1924. They were the working vocabulary of the doctoral seminar. The Bundesarchiv at Berlin-Lichterfelde holds the faculty rosters of every German university across this period, Series R4901 of the Reichsministerium files. The rosters do not lie. The Mandarins survived the Kaiser. They survived the war. They survived the November Revolution. They survived the inflation of 1923 that wiped out their middle-class savings. They survived the Republic itself. but their faith in the German university as a moral state that by 1930 had been replaced by something else, something they had been writing about in journals they themselves edited for a full decade. Göttingen, Tübingen, Marburg, how the student unions went brown before Berlin did. Baldur von Schirach was 22 years old in 1929. He was the son of an aristocratic theatre director, fluent in English, raised partly in America, married into the Hoffmann family of Munich photographers, and he had just been handed the leadership of the National Sozialistische Deutsche Studentenbund, the National Socialist German Student Union. The organization had been founded 3 years earlier, in 1926, by a Leipzig engineering student named Wilhelm Tempel, working out of a rented room on the Brüderstrasse. By the time Schirach took it over, the NSDSTB had something its parent party did not yet have. It had majorities. The standard archival reconstruction of what happened next is Jeffrey Giles, Students and National Socialism in Germany, Princeton University Press, 1985. Giles spent years in the Bundesarchiv Series R 4901/13208, the internal NSDSTB records, cross-referencing them with the ASTA, the Allgemeine Studierendenausschuss, the student government, election results university by university, semester by semester. The pattern he reconstructed is a pattern that contradicts everything the popular memory of the Weimar collapse has been taught to believe. Erlangen, 1929, NSDSTB majority. Greifswald, 1930, NSDSTB majority. Breslau, 1930. Gießen, 1930. Rostock, 1930. Berlin, 1931. Würzburg, 1931. Tübingen, 1932. Hamburg, 1932. By July 1932, when the NSDAP won 37.3% of the National Reichstag vote and became the largest party in Germany, the National Socialist Student Union had already held majorities in 16 of the 23 German universities for 2 full years. The students went brown before the country did. The mechanism is not mysterious. The students were the sons, and the small but documented minority of daughters, of the Bildungsbürgertum. Their fathers had been ruined by the 1923 inflation. Their professional futures, in a country with more doctorates per capita than any other and a job market collapsing under the 1929 depression, looked closed. The Akademische Schwemme, the academic glut, was a term coined in the German press of the period. Too many doctorates, too few chairs, too many junior lawyers, too few practices. The campaign issue the NSDSTB seized on was not unemployment, not reparations, not Versailles. It was the numerous clauses, the Jewish quota. The agitation across the German universities through 1928 and 1929 was for a hard cap on Jewish enrollment, a quota set in the NSDSTB's own published demands at the proportion of Jews in the German population. The agitation was not led by thugs in the streets. It was led by enrolled doctoral candidates. It was published in the Akademische Rundschau, the student periodical archive now held at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. It was debated in lecture halls. It was voted on in student elections. It won. The student union dues funded the agitation. The student union meetings held in university buildings under university procedure organized it. The student union officers, all of them in good academic standing, traveled to Munich to coordinate with the party leadership. Schirach himself moved between his Munich villa and the university towns on a near-weekly schedule, speaking in halls that the rectors of those universities had formally approved for use. Here is the document that changes everything. The historian Michael Cater, in the Nazi Party, A Social Profile, published 1983, performed a statistical reconstruction of the social composition of the NSDAP membership. The overrepresentation in the early party, the so-called Alte Kämpfer, the old fighters who joined before 1933, was not the unemployed worker, it was the university student and the recent graduate. Peter Merkel, in Political Violence Under the Swastika, 1975, performed a parallel statistical analysis of 581 early Nazi biographies drawn from the Theodore Abel collection at the Hoover Institution. The same finding emerged. The intellectual class led, the masses followed. This is the first big revelation. The question, why did the educated follow Hitler, assumes a sequence in which the educated were dragged along by the desperate and the uninformed. The archival record, Giles 1985, Cater 1983, Merkel 1975, all in published scholarship for half a century, shows the sequence reversed. The educated voted first. The student unions went brown before the working districts of Berlin did. This is not in dispute among specialist historians. The Bundesarchiv files are open. The election results are tabulated. The conclusion is not contested. The post-war consolation that Hitler was a working-class phenomenon, a panic of the lower middle class, a mob of the uneducated, was a narrative convenience. It was not a finding. The mandarins' sons led. The mandarins, watching their lecture halls fill with brown-shirted students chanting in the corridors, did not stop them. Many cheered. Some joined. The rest, with the granular caution of the credentialed German professor, watched and waited. The Deutsche Studentenschaft, the umbrella National Student Association, was captured by the NSDSTB at its July 1931 Graz Congress. From that point forward, the student leadership of every German university spoke with one political voice. The dueling fraternities, the Burschenschaften and the corps that had organized the social life of the German universities since the Napoleonic era, aligned themselves with the new student leadership through the 1932 academic year. Their alumni networks, bankers, judges, ministerial officials, regimental officers, were already, in many cases, sympathetic. The Reichsverband Deutsche Studenten, the older conservative student body that had once competed with the NSDSTB, dissolved itself in 1933 and recommended that its members transfer their loyalty to the National Socialist Union. The transfer was uneventful, the same students, the same fraternity colors at the meetings, the same dueling scars on the same faces, a different banner above the lectern. The radicalized cohort of 1928 produced specific names that would matter later. Hans Frank, born 1900, studied law at Munich, Kiel and Vienna and joined the National Socialist Party in 1923 at the age of 23. He would become the regime's general gouverneur of occupied Poland and would be put on trial at the principal Nuremberg Tribunal in 1946. Hans Globke, born 1898, completed his doctorate in law at Gießen in 1922 and would draft the official legal commentary on the 1935 racial laws. He would, after 1953, serve as the chief of staff to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. Reinhard Heydrich, born 1904, the son of a music conservatory director, attended the Naval Academy at Mürwik and would direct the Reich Security Main Office until his death in Prague in 1942. Werner Best, born 1903, took his doctorate in law at Heidelberg in 1927 and would become the senior SS jurist who drafted the operational framework for the security services. These were not the dispossessed. These were not the unemployed. These were the credentialed young men of the Bildungsbürgertum, holders of state-recognized professional qualifications, raised in the language of Lessing and Schiller, voting in their student elections through the late 1920s for the political project they would administer through the 1930s and 1940s. The book burnings of May 1933 were planned by that leadership in the spring of 1933 under the slogan Action wider den undeutschen Geist, the action against the UN German spirit. 12 theses were drafted. They were nailed, in deliberate echo of Luther, to the doors of university buildings across the country. The student union, not the party, supplied the lists of authors to be burned: Thomas Mann, Heinrich Heine, Sigmund Freud, Erich Maria Remarque, Karl Marx, Bertolt Brecht. The lists were drawn by graduate students who had read the books they were now consigning to the fire. And on the morning of January 30th, 1933, when the news reached Freiburg and Heidelberg that the Reichspräsident Paul von Hindenburg had appointed Adolf Hitler as Reichskanzler, the news was met in the lecture halls not with shock, but with prepared speeches that had been drafted in the weeks before. Heidegger at Freiburg, the rector who became the voice of the regime. Martin Heidegger was 43 years old. He was small, fastidious, a tireless walker of the Black Forest paths, the author of Sein und Zeit, the most influential philosophical work of the 20th century, and on April 21, 1933, his colleagues at the Albert-Ludwigs-Universität in Freiburg elected him rector. 10 days later, on May 1st, he applied for membership in the NSDAP card number 3125894. He kept the card current until 1945. On May 27, 1933, in the aula of the university, Before an audience that included senior party officials in uniform and the entire assembled faculty, he delivered the rectorate address that would be published within weeks by Wilhelm Weiss in Breslau under the title Die Selbstbehauptung der Deutschen Universität, the self-assertion of the German University. The text is held in the Universitätsarchiv Freiburg, Series B1, alongside the rector's complete correspondence for the year. The definitive archival reconstruction is Hugo Ott, Martin Heidegger, Unterwegs zu seiner Biographie, published 1988. The follow-on synthesis is Rüdiger Safranski, Ein Meister aus Deutschland, 1994. The mechanism Heidegger announced in that hall was the alignment of the German university with what the regime called the labor service, the military service, and the knowledge service of the new state. The university would not be a critic of the state. It would be its third pillar. The address closed with the Sieg Heil. The audience rose. Within months, the architecture was operational. It required almost no force. The April 7, 1933 civil service law, the Gesetz zur Wiederherstellung des Berufsbeamtentums, allowed the dismissal of Jewish faculty and faculty deemed politically unreliable. By the end of 1933, Edward Hartshorne's contemporaneous documentation in the German Universities and National Socialism, published 1937, recorded 1,145 academics dismissed under the law. The Notgemeinschaft Deutscher Wissenschaftler im Ausland, the emergency society of German scholars abroad, headquartered briefly in Zurich, counted the dismissed within months and circulated the names internationally. But the chairs were not empty. The chairs were filled by application. Here is the part the post-war consensus cannot explain away. The dismissals were not carried out by SS officers kicking down doors. They were processed by faculty committees, by the dismissed scholars' own departmental colleagues, voting to remove them under the procedures of the habilitation system, voting to fill the vacated chairs with candidates the committees themselves selected. The Bundesarchiv R 4901 dismissal files document the procedure case by case. The Göttingen Mathematics Department, under the chairmanship of Edmund Landau, lost Landau, Richard Courant, Emmy Noether, Hermann Weil, and a generation of students who left with them. The story of the dinner where the Prussian Minister of Culture asked David Hilbert what remained of Göttingen mathematics, and Hilbert's reply that nothing remained because it no longer existed, was already circulating in 1934. The chairs were filled within a single semester. The department recovered its teaching load. The journals continued to publish. In Frankfurt, the entire Institute for Sozialforschung, the Frankfurt School, closed. Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and the rest reconstituted the institute in exile, first in Geneva, then in New York at Columbia University. In Freiburg, Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, the man who had been Heidegger's own teacher and mentor, was stripped of his university privileges. Heidegger, as rector, signed the administrative order. The friendship ended. Husserl died in 1938, his unpublished manuscripts spirited to Leuven in a suitcase by a Belgian Franciscan priest named Herman van Breda. The manuscripts, all 40,000 pages of them, survived the war. The friendship did not. The architecture Heidegger gave the regime in philosophy, the jurist Carl Schmitt gave it in law. Schmitt was 45 years old, professor of constitutional law at Berlin, the author of Politische Theologie and Der Begriff des Politischen, and on the same day Heidegger applied for party membership, May 1, 1933. Schmitt applied as well. His treatise Staat, Bewegung, Volk, published later that year, provided the legal vocabulary for the dissolution of constitutional government. The party was not subordinate to the state. The party was the state's movement, its political form, its source of constitutional legitimacy. The Reichstag did not need to legislate. The Führer's will, transmitted through the party, was law. Schmitt wrote the legal commentary that defended the killings of the June 1934 Röhm Purge as an act of constitutional state protection. The article appeared in the Deutsche Juristenzeitung that August. It was titled, in the legal vocabulary the regime preferred, Der Führer schützt das Recht. The Führer protects the law. Schmitt held his Berlin chair until 1936. He was forced out of his official party functions then, not for opposition, but because his ideological loyalty had been called into doubt by SS rivals. He retained his professorship until 1945, his pension thereafter, and the international reputation that decades later would make him one of the most cited constitutional theorists of the 20th century. He died in his bed in 1985 in the village of his birth, holder of an honorary doctorate from the University of Murcia. The third architecture was scientific. Eugen Fischer was 59 years old. He was the founding director since 1927 of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics in Berlin-Dahlem. The institute had been built with Rockefeller Foundation money. Its scientific apparatus, the genealogical surveys, the twin studies, the statistical methods, was state-of-the-art. Fischer's institute provided what the regime called racial science. The framework, the diagrams, the technical vocabulary, the citation chains in international journals that lent the regime's racial law a scientific authority no thug in a brown shirt could have supplied. Fischer's student, Ottmar von Verschuer, would inherit the institute. Verschuer's doctoral student, a young physician named Josef Mengele, would receive his medical degree from Frankfurt in 1938 and his anthropology doctorate from Munich in 1935. The names connect, the institutions connect. The dissertations are on the shelves at Münster and Frankfurt and Munich. The full audit was published by the Max Planck Society's Presidential Commission in 17 volumes between 2000 and 2008. The Mandarins did not resist. They co-wrote. Heidegger in the lecture hall, Schmidt in the law faculty, Fischer in the laboratory. The dismissed scholars left the country. Lise Meitner, the Austrian-born physicist who had collaborated with Otto Hahn at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Chemistry since 1907 and who would, with her nephew Otto Frisch in Sweden in December 1938, give the first theoretical interpretation of nuclear fission, was protected by her Austrian citizenship until the Anschluss of March 1938. After the Anschluss, her citizenship became German, the racial laws applied, and within 4 months she was smuggled out of Berlin by Dutch colleagues with 10 Reichsmark in her purse and the diamond ring Hahn had pressed into her hand at the platform. She would never work in Germany again. The chairs were filled. The universities did not pause. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, how the credentialed professions joined the party. In Berlin in the year 1933, the Reichsärztekammer, the Reich Chamber of Physicians, became the licensing authority for every medical doctor practicing in Germany. Its president was Gerhard Wagner, born 1888, a Munich physician, an NSDAP member since 1929, and the architect of what the regime would build over the following decade, a medical profession bound to the regime not by ideology alone but by the structure of professional licensure itself. The definitive archival reconstruction is Robert Proctor, Racial Hygiene, Medicine Under the Nazis, Harvard University Press, 1988. The supporting profession-by-profession reconstruction is Konrad Jarausch, The Unfree Professions, German Lawyers, Teachers and Engineers, 1900 to 1950, Oxford, 1990. The companion volume is Michael Cater, Doctors Under Hitler, 1989. The numbers Proctor, Cater and Jarausch reconstruct from the Reichskammer membership rosters, held now at Bundesarchiv R18 and R1501, are the numbers that should have settled the question of who Hitler's base actually was decades ago. By 1942, 45% of all German physicians had joined the NSDAP, the highest party membership rate of any profession in the country. Biologists, 65%. Lawyers by 1937, 33%. Engineers, 24%. Teachers in the National Socialist Teachers League, the NSLB, by 1937, 97%. 97. The mechanism was bureaucratic, not violent. After 1935, the most prestigious appointments in medicine, law, the civil service, and the universities required in practice, if not always in formal regulation, party membership or membership in one of the approved professional chambers. The credentialed German, raised in the Humboldtian tradition to see the professional license as a constitutional rank, made the calculation that millions of his colleagues made. The party card was a career card. The career card was the continuation of the professional life the Bildungsbürgertum had spent a century constructing. The medical journals carried the message. The Deutsches Ärzteblatt, the official publication of the Reichsärztekammer, ran lead articles through 1933 and 1934 instructing the German physician on his new role as a guardian of the racial health of the Volk. The Münchener Medizinische Wochenschrift, the most prestigious medical periodical in the country, published the same vocabulary in its editorial columns. The vocabulary was technical, the diagrams were professional. The arguments were footnoted to international journals. The German physician reading them at his breakfast table saw the continuation of his professional formation, not a rupture from it. On July 14, 1933, 6 months into the regime, the Gesetz zur Verhütung erbkranken Nachwuchses was promulgated, the hereditary health law. It established the Erbgesundheitsgerichte, the hereditary health courts, which were authorized to order the involuntary sterilization of patients diagnosed with a list of conditions: hereditary feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, severe physical malformations, and severe alcoholism. The law was not drafted by SS officers. It was drafted by physicians. It was debated in the medical journals. It was voted into law by physicians' associations. The hereditary health court records held at Bundesarchiv R1501 document approximately 400,000 procedures carried out under the law between 1934 and 1945. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry in Munich, under Ernst Rudin, provided the scientific framework. Rudin held a medical doctorate from Heidelberg. He had trained in Zurich. He was, by 1933, one of the most cited psychiatric geneticists in the world. He had been a senior contributor to the international eugenics movement of the 1920s, a colleague of American researchers at Cold Spring Harbor, a frequent correspondent of British and Scandinavian colleagues. He retained his directorship throughout the regime. He died in 1952 in his Munich apartment after a brief post-war denazification proceeding that classified him as a Mitläufer, a fellow traveler. He paid a fine. He kept his pension. The same pattern repeated across professions. The Reichsrechtsanwaltskammer, the Reich Chamber of Lawyers, purged its Jewish members under the April 7th law. Their cases were redistributed to non-Jewish colleagues. The fees followed. The cases of Jewish clients followed. By 1938, after the Anschluss and the Kristallnacht, the legal apparatus that processed the confiscation of Jewish property was staffed entirely by credentialed German lawyers operating under the formal procedures of the Reich legal system. The deeds were notarized, the transfers were registered, the fees were collected, the court records exist. They are held, where they survived the war, in the regional Staatsarchive across Germany: Hamburg, Munich, Cologne, Düsseldorf. The historian Christoph Kreutzmüller, in his 2012 study of the dispossession of Berlin Jewish businesses, documented the procedure firm by firm. The lawyers who carried out the procedures were, in many cases, the lawyers who had previously represented the Jewish clients they were now expropriating. The licensing system made the substitution invisible to the casual observer. The same letterhead, the same office, the same procedure, a different name on the deed. The engineers were no less integrated. The Verein Deutscher Ingenieur, the Association of German Engineers, founded in 1856, restructured itself under regime principles within the first 2 years. The membership lists were combed, Jewish engineers were expelled. The technical journals, the VD Zeitschrift, the Stahlbau, the Bauingenieur, continued to publish under the same names of editors, with the same standards of peer review under reorganized boards. The IG Farben Chemical Combine, the Siemens Electrical Combine, the Krupp Steel Combine. These were staffed at the engineering level by men whose technical formation was the envy of the industrial world and whose political alignment was, by the late 1930s, the operational alignment of the regime. The Teachers' League, the NSLB, restructured the school curriculum. The historian's task, the biology lesson, the literature reading list, the music class, all were reshaped within 24 months. The 97% membership rate Jarosch documented was not coerced. It was, for many teachers, a genuine commitment. For the rest, it was a career calculation. The result was operationally identical. A generation of German children was instructed by certified pedagogues holding state teaching qualifications in a curriculum that prepared them for what came after. Here is what the credentialed German did between 1933 and 1939. He notarized the deed. He drafted the dissertation. He signed the sterilization order. He filed the requisition form. He published the article in the journal his university press still printed on the same paper it had always used. The persecution of the Jewish population of Germany, the deportation logistics, the camp system that would expand after 1939. Every administrative procedure these systems required was carried out by men with doctorates, men with law degrees, men with medical training, men whose professional formation had been the pride of the most credentialed nation on earth. The question is no longer whether the educated followed Hitler. The question is why a physician with 15 years of medical training, a 1928 dissertation on heart pathology, a wife and 2 children, and a comfortable practice in Stuttgart signed a sterilization order in 1936 without hesitation, and why in 1947 the same physician was back in practice. The science of the regime, from the lecture hall to the killing institutions. On October 1, 1939, Adolf Hitler signed a backdated authorization for what the regime's own paperwork called the destruction of life unworthy of life, and the program was placed under the administration of physicians. The document was dated to September 1st, the day the war began. It was countersigned by Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and Philipp Bauer, the chief of the Chancellery of the Führer. It was not a law, it was a one-page authorization typed on Reich Chancellery letterhead that conferred on Brandt and Bauer the responsibility for the program the regime designated by the address of its administrative office at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. The program would become known by that address, T4. The operational reconstruction is comprehensive in the Nuremberg medical trial transcripts, Case 1, United States versus Karl Brandt et al., 1946 to 1947, held at the U.S. National Archives in College Park under Record Group RG 238. The transcripts run to thousands of pages. They are online. They have been online since 1996. They name the institutions where the program was carried out: Grafeneck in Württemberg, Brandenburg and der Havel, Hartheim Castle near Linz in Austria, Sonnenstein in Saxony, Bernburg in Saxony-Anhalt, and Hadamar in Hesse. They name the staff, they name the physicians, they name the methods. Approximately 70,000 disabled patients died in these 6 institutions between January 1940 and August 1941, when public protest, most famously the August 3, 1941 sermon of the Catholic Bishop of Münster, Clemens August von Galen, forced the public phase of the program to halt. The sermon was reproduced in pamphlet form, smuggled across the Reich by Catholic laity, dropped over German cities by the Royal Air Force in the spring of 1942. The program did not halt. It decentralized. It moved into the medical wards of psychiatric hospitals across the Reich, where it continued by other means: starvation diets, withholding of treatment, lethal sedation, until 1945. The administering physicians were credentialed at German medical faculties. They had taken the Hippocratic Oath. They had passed the state examination. They held the rank of medicinal rat. The historian Henry Friedlander, in The Origins of Nazi Genocide, published 1995 by the University of North Carolina Press, traced the operational continuity from the T4 program to the camp system that followed. The same staff transferred east, applying the same techniques learned in the 6 institutions to the populations the regime designated for what it called the East. The personnel files exist. The transfers are documented. The continuity is not in dispute. In Berlin-Dahlem in the same years, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics continued its scientific work under Ottmar von Verschuer, who had succeeded Eugen Fischer as director in 1942. Verschuer's funding came from the Reichsforschungsrat, the Reich Research Council, under grant numbers documented in the Bundesarchiv R73 records and reconstructed in detail by the German biologist Benno Müller-Hill in his 1984 study Tödliche Wissenschaft. Verschuer was studying twins. The research samples, blood, eyes, tissue, were supplied from a single source. The supplier was his former doctoral assistant, a young SS Hauptsturmführer and physician named Josef Mengele, working as the senior camp physician at the Birkenau section of the Auschwitz complex from May 1943. The samples traveled by post. The reports traveled by post in the opposite direction. The grant numbers exist. The correspondence, partial but devastating in what it survives, is in the Verschuer papers at the Universitätsarchiv Münster. The mechanism the regime had built in Fischer's Institute in 1927, the scientific architecture of racial law, was now operationally connected to the camp at Auschwitz by a postal address. At Strasbourg, where the German Reichsuniversität had been installed in 1941 after the annexation of Alsace, The anatomist August Hirt assembled a comparative skeletal collection. The remains were sourced from prisoners selected at Auschwitz, transferred to the Natzweiler Struthof camp in the Vosges, and processed for the university's Anatomical Institute. The collection was discovered partially assembled by French and American forces in November 1944. The Nuremberg subsequent trials addressed the case. The remains were given burial. The reconstruction is in the trial transcripts. The remains were catalogued under university accession numbers. In Peenemünde, on the Baltic coast, the German Army's rocket program, the Aggregate 4 ballistic missile, known as the V2s, was developed under the technical leadership of a young engineering doctor named Werner von Braun, born 1912, holder of a doctorate in physics from the Friedrich Wilhelms Universität in Berlin, 1934. The serial production of the V2 was moved in 1943 after Allied bombing of Peenemünde to the underground Mittelbau-Dora complex in the Harz Mountains. The labor force was supplied from the camp system. Approximately 60,000 prisoners passed through Mittelbau-Dora. The historian Michael Neufeld, in The Rocket and the Reich, 1995, documented approximately 6,000 prisoner deaths in the production process, from exhaustion, from malnutrition, from disease, from the conditions of underground labor that the operational records of the camp system at the Stiftung Gedenkstätten Buchenwald und Mittelbau-Dora preserve in detail. Von Braun visited the production facility. The visits are in the record. In Heckingen, in the closing months of the war, Werner Heisenberg, the Nobel laureate physicist, the founder of quantum mechanics, was leading the scientific direction of the Uranverein, the regime's nuclear research program at the displaced Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. The program had not produced a weapon. Whether it could have, given more time and more resources, is debated. What is not debated is that the program existed, that it was funded, that it pursued the engineering of a chain reaction, and that Heisenberg directed it. Then the war ended. Heisenberg, von Braun, and 8 other senior German physicists were detained by the British at Farm Hall, an English country house outside Cambridge, between July and December 1945. Their conversations were recorded by hidden microphones. The transcripts were classified at the highest level. They were declassified in 1992 and published as Operation Epsilon, edited by the physicist Jeremy Bernstein. Within weeks of arriving at Farm Hall, Heisenberg and his colleagues had constructed the narrative the post-war world would receive. The German nuclear program had not produced a weapon because the German scientists had not wanted to produce one. The science had been instrumentalized. The scientists were innocent. The Farm Hall transcripts, when finally read, told a more complicated story. The physicists had not sabotaged the program. They had failed to solve the engineering problem. They had also, on the night of August 6, 1945, listened to the BBC News of Hiroshima in stunned silence, calculated within hours that the American device must have used uranium-235, and within days begun rehearsing the story they would tell when they were released. Here lands the second great revelation. The suppression of what German science had done under the regime was not a conspiracy, it was a historiographic structural outcome. The Cold War, beginning by 1947, required German scientific talent, the Soviet seizure of the German rocket teams it could capture, and the American Operation Paperclip recruitment of those it could secure first, including von Braun, transferred to the United States in September 1945 and eventually to NASA, where he directed the Saturn V program that placed Apollo astronauts on the Moon, meant that the careers of these men became, within a decade of the war's end, strategic assets of the Western Alliance. The Kaiser Wilhelm Society was renamed the Max Planck Society in 1948. Most of its leadership remained in place. The denazification system by then was collapsing under the sheer numbers it was meant to process. By 1945, the NSDAP membership card index held at the Bundesarchiv as Series R9361 recorded approximately 8 million members. The men who would have prosecuted the system thoroughly were dead, were exiled, or had been the system's victims. The archive existed. The Nuremberg medical trial transcripts had named the physicians. The grant numbers had documented the institutional connection. The names were known. But the synthesis, the public, popular narrative synthesis that would have told the post-war German public, in the language of the textbook and the news magazine, what the credentialed professions had done, was reduced to a sentence. The textbook sentence was, "Some scientists collaborated. When the war ended, the men who had signed the grants, written the dissertations, drafted the laws, and supervised the institutions were almost all alive in their 50s, professionally credentialed and looking for work." Denazification, the archive, and the questions still in the textbooks. In Nuremberg, in the autumn of 1946, an American prosecutor named Telford Taylor opened the case against 23 physicians of the Reich and discovered that 20 of them held doctorates from universities still operating, still teaching, still granting degrees that autumn. The case was United States versus Karl Brandt et al. It opened on December 9, 1946 and ran to August 1947. The verdicts were handed down. 7 of the defendants received the maximum sentence under the tribunal's authority and were put to death on June 2, 1948 at the Landsberg prison. The remaining defendants received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. Most were released by the mid-1950s under the broad clemency policies of the early Federal Republic. Karl Brandt's deputy at the Chief Medical Office, the surgeon and party physician Werner Haider, who had directed the medical phase of the T4 program under the cover name Dr. Sawad, was located in Schleswig-Holstein in 1959. Practicing under his alias as a respected forensic neurologist with a network of legal and medical colleagues who had been protecting him for 13 years. The denazification system that was supposed to have caught him had not caught him. It had not, by the numbers, caught most. The American zone, operating under the Spruchkammer tribunal system, processed approximately 3.6 million Fragebogen, the standardized denazification questionnaire, between 1945 and 1949. The system was designed to classify every adult German into one of 5 categories: major offender, offender, lesser offender, fellow traveler, exonerated. The system collapsed by 1948 under the numbers. The vast majority of cases were processed as Mitläufer, fellow travelers, with nominal fines and full restoration of civil rights. By 1951, the Adenauer government's Article 131 of the Basic Law restored civil service rights and pensions to almost all officials dismissed under denazification. By 1955, the historian Norbert Frey documented in his study Vergangenheitspolitik approximately 60% of West German federal judges had served in the regime's judicial system. The comparable figure in the Foreign Ministry was approximately 40%. The Federal Criminal Police Office, the Bundeskriminalamt, founded 1951, was staffed at senior levels by men whose careers had begun in the Reich Security Main Office. The independent commission that audited the Foreign Ministry's history, the Unabhängige Historiker Commission, published its findings in 2010 as Das Amt und die Vergangenheit. The findings were unsparing. The diplomatic service of the Federal Republic had been, in its first 2 decades, an institution of substantial continuity with the diplomatic service of the regime. The pattern was not hidden. It was, in the published German press of the 1950s, occasionally noted. It was not, by the political consensus of the early Federal Republic, made the central national question. There were urgent reasons. The German state was being rebuilt. The Cold War was on. The Western Alliance required a stable West Germany. The architects of the new state, Konrad Adenauer foremost, calculated that a thorough reckoning with the credentialed personnel of the previous 12 years would make the rebuilding impossible. The calculation was made. The credentialed personnel returned to their chairs, their courtrooms, their hospitals. The Bildungsbürgertum survived the war as it had survived the War of 1918. The reckoning was deferred. It was deferred to 1968. The generational rupture, when it came from the children of those credentialed parents. The student movement of 1968 in West Germany was, in a way that distinguished it from its French and American contemporaries, not primarily about Vietnam or about the consumer society. It was about the fathers. The Frankfurt psychoanalysts Alexander and Margaret Mitscherlich, in their 1967 study Die Unfähigkeit zu trauern, the inability to mourn, named the silence that had structured the post-war German family. The inability to mourn the regime was, the Mitscherlichs argued, a structural condition of the post-war German psyche, transmitted from the credentialed parents who could not speak of what they had done to the children who could not stop asking. The auditorium where the 1968 students confronted the rector of the Free University of Berlin had been built in 1954. The chairs in the room had been occupied, in some cases, by the same professors who had occupied chairs at the Friedrich Wilhelms Universität in 1939. The students knew the names, they had read the curriculum vitae, they had searched the dissertations. The first president of the Federal Republic, Theodor Heuss, himself a historian, a liberal, a man who had voted for the Enabling Act in March 1933 and lived with that vote for the rest of his life, had called the Leipzig professors' declaration of November 1933 the most shameful document in German academic history. The philosopher Karl Jaspers, in his 1946 lectures Die Schuldfrage, the question of German guilt, had drawn the distinction between criminal guilt, political guilt, moral guilt, and metaphysical guilt. The distinction had been published. It had not been broadly absorbed. Hannah Arendt, the philosopher who had once been Heidegger's student and lover, who had escaped Germany in 1933 and Vichy France in 1941, returned to Germany in 1949 on behalf of the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Organization and traveled through the country interviewing former colleagues. Her letters from that journey, published in her correspondence with Karl Jaspers, recorded the German Bildungsbürger she encountered in their reconstructed apartments. The same furniture, the same books, the same gestures of cultivated welcome, and the same inability, 12 years after the regime had begun and 4 years after it had ended, to say what they had done. Then, slowly, the archive began to open. The Berlin Document Center, which held the NSDAP membership card index under American administration since 1945, was returned to German control in 1994. The Bundesarchiv digitized the index. The historian Götz Ali, in Hitler's Volksstaat, published 2005, reconstructed the financial structure of the regime, the systematic transfer of wealth from the persecuted populations to the broad credentialed middle class, and demonstrated, document by document, the degree to which the regime had been a project of material benefit for the educated German. The Max Planck Society, the post-war successor to the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, commissioned a presidential commission in 1999 to audit its own institutional history under the regime. The commission worked for 9 years. It published its findings in 17 volumes through Wallstein Verlag, Göttingen, between 2000 and 2008. The findings were uncompromising. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes had been, in the Commission's documented reconstruction, operationally integrated into the regime's racial and military programs. Verschuer had directed the institute that received samples from Auschwitz. Rudin had directed the institute that provided the scientific framework for the hereditary health law. The leadership had been, in the post-war transition, substantially restored. Here lands the third revelation, and it is the one the average viewer is most likely never to have heard. Every claim in this account, the NSDSTB electoral majorities published by Giles in 1985, the 45% party physician rate documented by Proctor in 1988, the 97% NSLB teacher rate documented by Jarausch in 1990, the Verschuer-Mengele correspondence reconstructed by Müller-Hill in 1984, the T4 institutions named in the Nuremberg medical trial transcripts online since 1996, the post-war professional restoration reconstructed by Frey and Ali, the institutional audit completed by the Max Planck Commission in 2008, the Foreign Ministry continuity documented by the Historiker Commission in 2010, is in the published archival historiography. The Bundesarchiv files are open, the card index is searchable. The dissertations are on the shelves, the trial transcripts are online. The granular truth has not been suppressed. It has been published, peer-reviewed, indexed, and made retrievable for half a century. The reason most people still believe that Hitler was carried by the uneducated, the unemployed, and the desperate is not that the archive failed. It is that the answer the archive gives is unbearable. The most credentialed nation on earth voted, taught, dissected, prescribed, theorized, and notarized its way into the regime. The educated were not the catastrophe's victims. They were its architects. The textbook sentence, that in a time of economic crisis the German people turned to extremism, is not factually false. It is a sentence written to make the answer survivable. The Leipzig Declaration of November 11, 1933, with its 960 signatures, is still on its shelf in Dresden. The men who signed it died old, in their own beds, in cities they had helped to ruin and that had been rebuilt around them. The bound volume sits in its shelf in Dresden, beige cardstock. Gothic title, the names by hand on the back pages. Most of these men lived into the 1960s. Their pensions were paid. The most educated nation in the world followed Hitler not in spite of its education, but through the channels its education had built. In a third-floor apartment on the Caspar-David-Friedrich-Straße in Dresden, while the men who had taken his chair at the Technische Hochschule were lecturing 2 streets over, the Romance philologist Victor Klemperer kept a diary. He had been stripped of his professorship in 1935. He survived the regime because his wife was not Jewish, because the Dresden firebombing of February 1945 destroyed the papers that would have sent him to the camp, and because the war ended weeks later. He published his philological notebook in 1947 as LT1, Notizbuch eines Philologen. Words, he wrote in the Reclam edition, can be like tiny doses of arsenic. They are swallowed unnoticed, appear to have no effect, and then the toxic reaction sets in after all. The men who taught the country how to think had administered the doses. They had also been the first to swallow them. The catastrophe was not a failure of education, it was a use of it. This content is for educational and historical reflection purposes only. For academic citation, please consult the primary archival sources referenced.